Billionaire CEO expected her to look tattered at the event, but was stunned by her glow and elegance. "Susan." Maxwell's voice carried that familiar note of authority that had once made her feel simultaneously protected and controlled. "I must say, you look unexpected tonight." "Unexpected," Susan replied, emerald necklace gleaming at her throat. "Or just not desperate enough for your liking?" The ballroom seemed to still around them as Maxwell's practiced smile faltered. 6 years of carefully crafted narratives about his ex-wife's incompetence threatened to unravel in a single moment. Have you ever been written off by someone who once claimed to love you? Ever had someone powerful try to rewrite your story, expecting you to fade away into insignificance? Tonight, I'm sharing the story of a woman who refused to become the broken, diminished version her billionaire ex-husband tried to create through his wealth and influence. What happens when the woman expected to arrive in tatters shows up glowing with success instead? Stay with me to witness one of the most satisfying moments of poetic justice I've ever encountered. Hello, my beautiful queens. Today's story touches something deep in all of us who've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or had our worth questioned. When someone with power tries to diminish you, especially someone who once claimed to cherish you, it cuts deeper than any physical wound. The scars from that betrayal can make us question everything about ourselves. But I want you to remember something essential. No one, not a husband, not a boss, not anyone with wealth or influence, gets to write the final chapter of your story. Only you hold that pen. Susan's journey from the ashes of a devastating divorce to the moment of her triumphant return isn't just about revenge or proving someone wrong. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that others tried to take from you. It's about standing in your truth when the world has been fed lies. The tension between Susan and Maxwell was palpable, stretching across the opulent ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel like an invisible thread. Around them, New York's elite pretended not to stare, but their attention was unmistakable. The unexpected reunion of Manhattan's most notorious divorced couple was the evening's unscheduled entertainment. "I'm simply surprised to see you here," Maxwell recovered smoothly, his silver hair catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. "It's been quite some time since you've attended one of our events." 6 years, 2 months, and approximately 15 days, Susan said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But who's counting?" Beside her, Josephine made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Her crimson gown stood in vibrant contrast to Susan's elegant black Valentino, the sisters a study in complementary strength. Maxwell's gaze flicked to Josephine, his distaste barely concealed. "Josephine, still the devoted sister, I see." "Always," Josephine replied sweetly. "Someone has to be, given how quickly some people discard their family commitments." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're looking well," he said to Susan, his eyes taking in the elegant dress, the emerald necklace, the confident posture. The pause before the final word spoke volumes. He'd expected, perhaps even hoped, to see her diminished, confirming the narrative he'd constructed. Instead, she stood before him radiating the quiet confidence that comes from rebuilding a life on one's own terms. "Thank you," Susan said simply. "Your event seems to be a success, as always." "We've raised over $3 million already tonight," he replied, unable to resist the opportunity to emphasize his philanthropic success. "The children's wing at Memorial will be named after my mother." "Not their mother," Susan noted. "His mother." Another erasure of their shared history. "How wonderful," she said. "Eliza will be pleased to hear it. She has fond memories of her grandmother." The mention of their daughter shifted something in Maxwell's expression. "How is she?" "Thriving," Susan said truthfully. "She's at the top of her class, captain of the debate team, and considering pre-law programs for college." "Following in my footsteps," Maxwell said with satisfaction. "Actually, she's interested in family law and advocacy for children of divorce," Susan corrected him gently. "She has some rather strong opinions about how the system can be manipulated by those with resources." The implication hung in the air between them. Maxwell's expression hardened. "If you'll excuse me," he said stiffly, I should attend to my other guests." As he walked away, Josephine let out a low whistle. "That was masterful, Sue. You didn't raise your voice once, but you might as well have slapped him." "That wasn't my intention," Susan said, though she couldn't deny the satisfaction of finally standing her ground. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who once claimed to love you, hit that like button right now. 6 days earlier, Susan had been standing in her modest kitchen, staring at the embossed invitation that had arrived that morning. Her fingers traced the raised gold lettering announcing the Westbrook Foundation's annual charity gala, feeling the weight of the heavy cardstock. Maxwell always insisted on the finest stationery, believing it reflected the caliber of the man behind it. From the desk of Maxwell Westbrook, the handwritten note at the bottom read, "Your presence is specifically requested." The invitation looked absurdly out of place among the ordinary trappings of her new life. The marble countertops and crystal chandeliers of her past had been replaced by practical laminate and simple pendant lighting in the townhouse she now called home. The transition from billionaire's wife to middle-class single mother had been brutal, but she'd survived. More than survived, she'd rebuilt. The interior design business she'd started from scratch now employed 7 people. Her relationship with 16-year-old Eliza, after years of court-supervised visitation and Maxwell's constant interference, had finally stabilized into something genuine and loving. She'd even started dating again cautiously. So why would Maxwell invite her to his gala now, after years of ensuring she was excluded from the social circles they once dominated together? Her phone buzzed with a text from Josephine. "Did you get one too?" Susan frowned. Josephine had received an invitation? That made even less sense. Maxwell had always treated her sister with barely concealed disdain, considering her too outspoken, too unpolished for his rarefied world. "Yes. Are you going?" Susan texted back. "Hell yes. After what he did to you. I wouldn't miss the chance to see his face when you walk in looking absolutely stunning." Susan smiled despite herself. Josephine had been her fiercest defender throughout the divorce, even when friends they'd had for decades chose sides. Maxwell sighed, invariably, given his power and influence. Another text arrived. "Besides, I heard through Diane that he's expecting you to look appropriately diminished by your reduced circumstances." Direct quote. Diane had been their housekeeper for 15 years, staying on with Maxwell after the divorce. She'd always had a soft spot for Susan, occasionally passing along information despite the risk to her employment. The thought of Maxwell discussing her appearance, expecting her to look shabby or desperate, ignited something in Susan's chest, a familiar fire she hadn't felt in years. Not since the day she'd finally stood up in court and fought back against his accusations. "Mom!" Eliza's voice came from the hallway. "What's that?" Susan turned to see her daughter eyeing the invitation, her dark hair, so like Maxwell's, pulled back in a casual ponytail, her keen eyes, so like Susan's own, missing nothing. "Your father's annual gala," Susan answered honestly. They'd worked hard to establish trust, and that meant no more secrets, no more pretending. "He invited you?" Eliza's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Why?" "I'm not entirely sure," Susan admitted. "But I think he expects me to decline, or to show up looking." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Broken," Eliza supplied with the directness of youth. "Something like that." Eliza picked up the invitation, studying it with an expression that reminded Susan painfully of Maxwell in his more calculating moments. "You should go," she said finally. "And you should look amazing." "Eliza!" "No, Mom, listen." Her daughter's eyes flashed with determination. "I've heard the things he says about you when he thinks I'm not paying attention. How you couldn't handle the real world without his money. How you're probably struggling to keep the lights on." She set the invitation down with deliberate care. It's time he saw the truth. The truth. Such a simple concept, yet it had been the casualty of Maxwell's campaign against her. His carefully constructed narrative, that Susan had been a trophy wife with expensive tastes who couldn't function without his guidance and wealth, had been repeated so often in their social circles and the business world that it had taken on the patina of fact. "I'm not sure it matters what he thinks anymore," Susan said. though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. It matters because he's still telling the story, Eliza insisted, and people are still believing it, including some of my friends' parents. She crossed her arms, looking suddenly older than her 16 years. I'm tired of hearing whispers about my mom that I know aren't true. Susan felt a surge of protective love for her daughter, who had been caught in the middle of their battle for too long. Perhaps Eliza was right. Perhaps it was time to confront the narrative head-on. If I go, she said slowly, it can't be about revenge or proving something to your father. That would just give him more power. Then make it about you, Eliza said simply. About showing up as exactly who you are now. Successful, independent, and happy without him. Susan looked at her daughter with newfound respect. When had Eliza become so wise? Besides, Eliza added with a mischievous smile that reminded Susan of herself at that age, I happen to know that Grandmother Monroe's emerald necklace is still in the safe deposit box. The one Dad always hated because it wasn't from him. The emerald necklace. A family heirloom that had belonged to Susan's grandmother. A formidable woman who had built a small empire of her own in the 1950s, when female entrepreneurs were rare. Maxwell had indeed disliked it, preferring that Susan wear only the jewelry he selected and controlled. That's true, Susan said thoughtfully, and I believe I still have that black Valentino somewhere. The one with the low back? Eliza grinned. Perfect. As they began to plan, Susan felt something shift inside her. A reclaiming of parts of herself that had been dormant since the divorce. Not the external trappings of wealth that Maxwell had used to define her, but the confidence, the sense of self-worth that had been systematically undermined. She picked up her phone and texted Josephine back. I'm going, and I'm going to need your help. The night of the gala arrived with a crystalline autumn chill in the air. Susan stood before her bedroom mirror, hardly recognizing the woman reflected back at her. Not because of the elegant black Valentino that still fit perfectly, or the emerald necklace gleaming at her throat, but because of the quiet strength in her eyes. The last time she'd attended the Westbrook Gala, she'd been Maxwell's wife, carefully curated to reflect his taste and status. Tonight, she was entirely herself. You look incredible, Mom, Eliza said from the doorway, her expression a mixture of pride and something else, a fierce protectiveness that touched Susan deeply. Thank you, sweetheart. Susan turned from the mirror. Are you sure you're okay staying with Aunt Jo's kids tonight? Positive. Besides, someone needs to keep those little monsters in line. Eliza smiled, referring to her younger cousins. Just promise you'll tell me everything tomorrow. Every detail, Susan promised, gathering her small clutch purse. Another remnant from her previous life, rescued during the hasty packing when Maxwell had given her 24 hours to leave their home. The memory of that day washed over her unexpectedly. The shock of Maxwell's ultimatum, delivered with the same cool precision he used in business negotiations. The frantic packing, trying to decide what pieces of her life she could salvage in the time allowed. The way he'd stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her with detached interest, as if her distress was a curious social experiment. You'll realize soon enough that you can't survive without me, he'd said, his voice matter of fact. I've given you everything you have, Susan. Your social standing, your lifestyle, even your sense of taste. Without me, what are you, really? At the time, the question had struck her like a physical blow because she hadn't known the answer. After 15 years of gradually surrendering her identity to become the perfect complement to Maxwell Westbrook, she'd lost sight of who Susan Monroe had been before him. The doorbell rang, jolting her back to the present. Josephine had arrived, resplendent in a crimson gown that showcased her curves and vibrant personality. Well, don't you look like $1,000,000, Josephine said, embracing her sister. Or should I say $1 billion? Maxwell is going to swallow his tongue. That's not why I'm going, Susan reminded her, though she couldn't suppress a small smile. Of course not, Josephine agreed, not sounding convinced in the slightest. We're going to support the Children's Hospital. The fact that your ex-husband will be there, expecting you to look like a charity case, is completely irrelevant. Eliza laughed. I like the way Aunt Jo thinks. That's because you're both troublemakers? Susan said fondly, kissing her daughter goodbye. Don't wait up too late. As they settled into the hired car, another concession to the evening, as Susan typically used public transportation or her modest sedan, Josephine turned to her with a more serious expression. Are you ready for this? Really ready? Because once we walk through those doors, every eye in the place will be on you. Susan took a deep breath. I think I am. It's been 6 years, Joe. 6 years of rebuilding while he did everything possible to make it harder. I'm not the same person he discarded. No, Josephine agreed, squeezing her hand. You're stronger, but that doesn't mean tonight will be easy. The car pulled up to the gleaming facade of the Westbrook Hotel, Maxwell's flagship property and the crown jewel of his hospitality empire. Red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance, lined with photographers capturing the arrival of New York's elite. Susan felt a momentary flutter of panic. She hadn't considered the media presence. Of course there would be photographers. Maxwell never missed an opportunity for publicity. Second thoughts? Josephine asked, noting her hesitation. No, Susan said firmly. Just adjusting my expectations. As they stepped onto the red carpet, a few heads turned. Then more. Whispers rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned. Susan Westbrook. No, Monroe now she'd reclaimed her maiden name had returned. Cameras flashed. Susan held her head high, channeling the poise that had once been as natural as breathing. She heard her name being called by photographers who remembered her from before, their tones surprised but not unkind. Inside the grand ballroom, the murmurs grew louder. The space was exactly as Susan remembered, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light over marble floors, floral arrangements towering from every table, the Westbrook signature orchids prominently featured. There he is, Josephine murmured, nodding toward the far side of the room. Maxwell Westbrook stood in a circle of admirers, impeccable in his tuxedo, silver hair perfectly styled, his commanding presence unchanged by the years. Unlike Susan, he had chosen not to remarry after their divorce, focusing instead on expanding his empire and, if rumors were to be believed, enjoying the company of a rotating cast of much younger women. As if sensing her gaze, Maxwell looked up. The moment their eyes met across the crowded room, Susan saw it, the flash of shock, quickly masked, as he registered her appearance. Not the diminished, struggling ex-wife he'd expected, but a woman who had not only survived his attempts to destroy her, but had emerged more radiant than before. Mission accomplished, Josephine whispered with satisfaction. Now let's get a drink before he comes over here. But it was too late. Maxwell was already making his way toward them, his expression now carefully composed into a mask of polite surprise. Now, as Maxwell retreated across the ballroom, Susan allowed herself a moment to breathe. The confrontation had been brief but intense, like the concentrated essence of their entire relationship. His assumption of control, her quiet resistance, the subtle power struggle beneath polite words. Maybe not consciously, Josephine replied, guiding her toward the bar. But somewhere deep down, you've been waiting 6 years to show him exactly who you've become without him. Perhaps her sister was right. As they moved through the ballroom, Susan became aware of the glances, the whispers, the reassessment happening in real time. For years, these same people had accepted Maxwell's version of events without question. Now they were seeing the evidence of its falsehood with their own eyes. At the bar, they encountered Diane, Maxwell's longtime housekeeper, who was taking a rare break from her duties. Ms. Monroe, she said warmly, using Susan's maiden name with pointed respect. It's wonderful to see you. You too, Diane, Susan replied, genuinely pleased. How have you been? Well enough, Diane said, lowering her voice. Though the house hasn't been the same since you left. Miss Eliza's visits are the only bright spots these days. I'm sure Maxwell keeps things interesting, Josephine interjected with barely disguised curiosity. Diane's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes spoke volumes. Mr. Westbrook has been focused on his work. The house feels empty most of the time. Some men don't know what they have until it's gone, Josephine murmured into her champagne. Josephine, Susan admonished, though she couldn't help wondering if Maxwell ever regretted the scorched earth approach he'd taken to their divorce. I should get back to work, Diane said, glancing over her shoulder. But Ms. Monroe, I wanted to tell you, many of us who worked for the family have followed your business in the design magazines. That hotel renovation in Chicago was spectacular. Susan felt a rush of genuine pleasure at the compliment. The Chicago project had been a turning point for her firm, establishing her reputation beyond the shadow of being Maxwell Westbrook's ex-wife. Thank you, Diane. That means a lot. As Diane slipped away, Susan's mind drifted back to the early days of her marriage, when her design talents had been one of the things Maxwell had most admired about her. Or so she'd thought. They'd met at a gallery opening in Soho, Susan fresh out of design school and working for a small but respected firm, Maxwell already a rising star in real estate development. He'd been drawn to her passionate analysis of the gallery's spatial flow, listening with genuine interest as she explained how the architect had manipulated light and shadow to enhance the artwork. You see things others don't, he'd told her that night, his amber eyes warm with admiration. I could use someone with your vision. Within 6 months, she was working as a design consultant for his first boutique hotel. Within a year, they were engaged. The whirlwind romance had seemed like a fairy tale. The brilliant, handsome billionaire and the talented young designer creating beautiful spaces together. What she hadn't understood then was that together meant something very different to Maxwell. As their personal and professional lives merged, her contributions gradually became absorbed into his brand. Designs she created were presented as Maxwell Westbrook's vision brought to life. Her innovative approaches to space and light became the signature Westbrook aesthetic. At first, she'd accepted this as the natural order of things. Maxwell was the face of the company, the visionary leader. Of course, the work would be presented under his name. But slowly, subtly, her professional identity had been erased, her talent repackaged as an extension of his genius. You don't need the credit, he'd explained when she finally raised the issue, 5 years into their marriage. You're Mrs. Westbrook now. Everything I achieve, we achieve together. It had sounded reasonable, even generous. Only later did she understand it was the beginning of her erasure, not just professionally but personally as well. The emerald necklace had been one of the first battlegrounds. A gift from her grandmother on her 21st birthday, the Art Deco piece was both valuable and deeply meaningful. Her grandmother, Evelyn Monroe, had built a successful interior design firm in Chicago in the 1950s, when female entrepreneurs were rare and often dismissed. This belonged to my mother, Evelyn had told her, clasping the necklace around Susan's neck. She sold everything else to keep our family afloat during the Depression, but she held on to this. It reminded her that beauty and value endure, even through the hardest times. Whenever you wear it, remember that you come from women who create beauty and survive hardship. Maxwell had hated the necklace from the first time he saw it. Not because it wasn't beautiful, even he acknowledged its exceptional craftsmanship, but because it represented a part of Susan he couldn't claim or control. It doesn't suit you, he'd say whenever she wore it. It's too provincial. You're a Westbrook now. You should wear pieces that reflect our standing. Our standing. His standing. The distinction had blurred in those early years, as she gradually surrendered pieces of herself to become the perfect complement to Maxwell Westbrook. Susan, are you all right? Josephine's voice pulled her back to the present. Just remembering, Susan replied, taking a sip of her champagne. Well, don't get lost in there, Josephine advised. The past is a nice place to visit, but you don't want to live there, especially not tonight. Susan smiled at her sister's practical wisdom. You're right. Tonight is about the present. And the future, Josephine added with a meaningful glance across the room, where Lawrence Harrington had just entered the ballroom. Lawrence had once been one of Maxwell's closest friends and business partners, though rumors of a falling out had circulated for years. His presence tonight was surprising. Maxwell typically excised former allies from his life with surgical precision. As if sensing their attention, Lawrence looked their way. His expression shifted from polite social scanning to genuine surprise and pleasure when he spotted Susan. He excused himself from his current conversation and made his way toward them. "Susan Monroe," he called as he approached. "As I live and breathe." "Lawrence," she greeted him with genuine warmth. "It's been too long." "Indeed it has," he agreed, kissing her cheek. "Though I've been following your career with interest. That boutique hotel chain you redesigned has been stealing my best corporate clients." Susan laughed. "Hardly stealing. Just offering an alternative aesthetic that happens to resonate with a certain clientele. An aesthetic that bears your unmistakable signature," Lawrence said, his admiration evident. "You always did have an eye for transforming spaces, even back when Maxwell insisted on taking credit for your ideas." The observation, casually delivered but pointed, confirmed what Susan had long suspected, that at least some in their circle had seen through Maxwell's carefully constructed narrative even before tonight. "You're too kind," she said, deflecting the compliment with practiced grace. "Not kind enough," Lawrence replied, his expression turning serious. "I should have reached out after the divorce. The way Maxwell handled things. It wasn't right." Susan felt a tightness in her chest at the unexpected acknowledgement. For years, she'd believed that everyone in their shared social circle had accepted Maxwell's version of events without question. The possibility that some had seen the truth but remained silent was both validating and painful. "It was a difficult time," she said simply. "For what it's worth," Lawrence continued, lowering his voice, "not everyone believed what Maxwell said about you. Some of us remembered the brilliant woman who transformed the Wellington Hotel from a dated disaster into the most sought-after boutique property in Chicago. That kind of talent doesn't vanish overnight, regardless of what convenient narrative Maxwell was spinning. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone tried to tear it down, comment rising below. The Wellington Hotel. Susan hadn't thought about that project in years, though it had once been her proudest achievement. The historic property had been on the verge of demolition when Westbrook Enterprises acquired it. Maxwell had initially planned to raise the building and construct a modern high-rise, but Susan had convinced him of the potential in preserving and reimagining the 1920s gem. For 6 months, she'd poured herself into the project, researching the building's history, working with local artisans to restore original features while introducing contemporary elements that honored rather than erased the past. The result had been spectacular. A perfect balance of historic charm and modern luxury that had put Westbrook Hotels on the map as a serious player in the boutique hotel market. The opening gala had been Susan's triumph. Critics raved, industry leaders took notice, and reservations flooded in. It should have been the beginning of her rise as a respected designer in her own right. Instead, it became the beginning of her erasure. "My wife has such a good eye for detail," Maxwell had told reporters that night, his arm around her waist in what appeared to be a loving gesture but felt more like possession. "She's helped select some of the decorative elements that really finish the spaces I've envisioned." Decorative elements. As if her comprehensive redesign of the entire property, from structural changes to lighting concepts to custom furniture, could be reduced to throw pillows and wall art. She'd started to correct him, but he'd squeezed her waist in warning, his smile never faltering. Later, in their hotel suite, she'd confronted him. "Why did you do that? You know I did more than select decorative elements. This entire concept was my vision." "Don't be dramatic, Susan," he'd replied, loosening his tie with practiced ease. "Everyone knows you're talented, but this is business. Westbrook Hotels is my company, my brand. The market responds to a singular vision, not a committee. I'm not a committee. I'm your wife and the lead designer on this project." "Exactly. You're my wife. Everything we do as a team with me as the public face. That's how this works." He'd approached her then, tilting her chin up with one finger. "Don't you trust me to know what's best for us? For our future?" The question had been delivered with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that she doubted herself. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was how successful partnerships worked. Maybe her desire for recognition was selfish, even counterproductive to their shared goals. It was only years later, after the divorce, that she recognized this moment for what it was. The first major fracture in the foundation of their marriage, the first time she'd clearly seen Maxwell's need to diminish her in order to elevate himself. "The Wellington is still one of my favorite hotels in Chicago," Lawrence was saying, pulling her back to the present. "Though I have to say, your work on the Archer Group's boutique chain might have surpassed it. The Phoenix property in particular is extraordinary." The Phoenix, her first major commission after the divorce, and the project that had saved her fledgling design firm from collapse. Named for the mythical bird reborn from ashes, the hotel had been a labor of love and necessity. If it had failed, she would have been forced to abandon her independent practice and seek employment with an established firm. Exactly as Maxwell had predicted she would. "Susan will come crawling back within 6 months," he told their mutual friends, not bothering to lower his voice at the charity event where she'd overheard him. "She has expensive taste but limited talent. Without my connections and guidance, she'll be designing mall food courts by Christmas." The memory of those words had fueled her through sleepless nights working on the Phoenix designs, through the anxiety of pitching her concepts to skeptical executives, through the grueling construction phase when every decision felt weighted with the potential for catastrophic failure. When the hotel opened to rave reviews, with specific praise for the bold, innovative design that reimagines desert luxury, she'd allowed herself one small act of defiance. She'd sent Maxwell a copy of Architectural Digest featuring the Phoenix on its cover, with her name prominently credited as the designer. No note, no comment, just evidence that his prediction had been wrong. He'd never acknowledged receiving it. But 3 weeks later, he'd filed for full custody of Eliza, claiming Susan's erratic work schedule and financial instability made her an unfit mother. The custody battle that followed had been the darkest period of Susan's life. Maxwell had deployed his considerable resources like weapons, high-priced attorneys, private investigators documenting every parenting imperfection, expert witnesses testifying to the superior stability of Eliza living in the family home with her father rather than in Susan's modest apartment. "He's trying to punish me for succeeding without him," she told her attorney, a kind but overworked public defender who was clearly outmatched by Maxwell's legal team. "Probably," the attorney had agreed wearily, "but we need to focus on what the judge will see. A mother with an unpredictable income and demanding work schedule versus a father with unlimited resources and a stable home environment." In the end, she'd kept primary custody, but barely. The judge had been troubled by Maxwell's obvious attempt to weaponize his wealth, but equally concerned about Susan's financial stability. The resulting arrangement had been a compromise that satisfied no one. Susan retained primary physical custody, but Maxwell received extensive visitation rights and significant decision-making power over Eliza's education and activities. More painfully, the court had ordered supervised visitation for the first year, based on Maxwell's carefully constructed concerns about Susan's emotional stability following the divorce. The humiliation of having a court-appointed observer present during time with her own daughter had nearly broken her. "Mom isn't unstable," 12-year-old Eliza had declared during one such supervised visit, her young face fierce with indignation. "Dad just says that because she cried when he told her to leave our house." Out of the mouths of babes. The supervisor had noted the comment in her report, and 6 months later, the supervision requirement had been lifted. But the damage to Susan's reputation had been done. In the rarefied social circles where Maxwell held sway, she had been successfully recast as emotionally fragile, professionally desperate, and socially irrelevant. Until tonight. "The Phoenix was a turning point for me," Susan told Lawrence, allowing herself a small smile of pride. "In more ways than one." "I can imagine," he replied, his gaze drifting briefly to where Maxwell stood across the room, now deep in conversation with the mayor but clearly aware of Susan's interaction with his former friend. "Some men can't stand to see a woman succeed without them, especially when they've convinced themselves they were the source of her value." The insight was so accurate that Susan felt momentarily disoriented, as if Lawrence had read her private thoughts. "You seem to understand the situation rather well." "Let's just say I've seen similar dynamics play out before," Lawrence said cryptically. "But enough about the past. Tell me about your current projects. I hear you've expanded beyond hospitality design." As Susan described her firm's recent work on a women's business center in downtown Manhattan, she was aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. People who had been carefully avoiding her earlier in the evening were now finding reasons to drift closer, to enter her orbit. A former friend made eye contact and offered a tentative smile. A business associate of Maxwell's actually approached to compliment her on the Phoenix design. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, the collective assessment of her worth adjusting upward with each successful interaction, each demonstration that she was not the diminished figure Maxwell had described. Susan. A familiar voice interrupted her conversation with Lawrence. I wonder if I might steal you away for a moment? There's someone who's been eager to meet you. She turned to find Richard Archer, founder of the Archer Group and the client behind the Phoenix Hotel, standing beside a striking woman in her 60s with silver hair and keen eyes. Of course, Susan replied, excusing herself from Lawrence with a promise to continue their conversation later. Susan Monroe, may I present Victoria Chun, CEO of Meridian Properties, Richard said as they moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Victoria, this is the designer I've been telling you about. Victoria Chun. The name was familiar. Meridian was one of the fastest-growing luxury property developers in the country, with a reputation for innovative, sustainable design and a commitment to working with women-owned businesses. Ms. Monroe. Victoria extended her hand with a firm grip. Your reputation precedes you. The Phoenix is one of my favorite spaces in the Southwest, and I was impressed by your work on the Women's Business Center in Manhattan. Thank you, Susan replied, genuinely flattered that someone of Victoria's stature was familiar with her portfolio. The Women's Center was a labor of love. We wanted to create a space that felt both empowering and nurturing. You succeeded, Victoria said with approval, which is why I wanted to meet you tonight. Meridian is developing a new concept, a collection of women-focused luxury hotels designed specifically for female business travelers. Spaces that address the unique needs and preferences of women without resorting to patronizing pink aesthetics or superficial, feminine touches. Susan felt a flutter of excitement. This was exactly the kind of project she dreamed of pursuing, meaningful, innovative, aligned with her values. That sounds fascinating, she said carefully, not wanting to appear too eager despite her growing interest. We're assembling a team of women designers to create the flagship property in Chicago, Victoria continued. Richard speaks very highly of your work, and based on what I've seen, I'd like to invite you to be part of that team, potentially as the lead designer, depending on how our initial conversations go. Susan felt momentarily speechless. Lead designer on a groundbreaking project for Meridian Properties? The opportunity was beyond anything she dared hope for tonight. She was acutely aware of Maxwell watching from across the room, his expression unreadable as he observed her conversation with Victoria Chun. I'm honored you'd consider me, Susan finally said, finding her voice. The concept sounds revolutionary. I'd love to hear more about your vision. Victoria smiled, a quick, decisive expression that suggested she wasn't a woman who wasted time on pleasantries when business could be discussed. Excellent. My office will contact yours next week to set up a proper meeting. For now, I'll just say that we're looking for someone who understands that luxury for women isn't about delicate furnishings and pastel colors. It's about thoughtful design that respects our needs without drawing attention to them. Security, functionality, and comfort without compromise. Susan nodded, already envisioning possibilities. Spaces that anticipate needs rather than simply responding to them. Exactly, Victoria looked pleased. Richard said you'd understand immediately. Most designers want to create pretty spaces for women. I want to create powerful ones. As they continued discussing the project, Susan became aware of a subtle shift in the room's energy. More people were glancing their way, recognizing the significance of Susan Monroe in deep conversation with Victoria Chun. In their world of wealth and influence, such connections were currency, and Susan's stock was visibly rising. Richard excused himself to greet another guest, leaving Susan and Victoria to continue their discussion. As they spoke, Susan couldn't help noticing how Victoria occasionally glanced toward Maxwell with an expression that suggested history. Not romantic, but certainly complex. You're probably wondering about the elephant in the room, Victoria said finally, following Susan's gaze to where Maxwell now stood alone, watching them with barely concealed intensity. I wouldn't presume to ask, Susan replied diplomatically. Maxwell and I have known each other for 30 years, Victoria said matter-of-factly. We were rivals in the Chicago market before he expanded to New York. He outbid me on 3 major properties in the 90s, and I returned the favor in the early 2000s. There's a certain respect between us, though I doubt he'd use that word. Susan nodded, understanding the complex dynamics of business relationships in their world. And yet you're here at his gala. Business is business, Victoria shrugged elegantly. Besides, I make a point of supporting children's healthcare initiatives, regardless of who's hosting the event. She paused, studying Susan with those keen eyes. Just as I make a point of recognizing talent regardless of whose ex-wife possesses it. The directness was refreshing after years of navigating the careful euphemisms and veiled meanings of Maxwell's social circle. I appreciate that more than I can express, Susan said honestly. I thought you might. Victoria glanced at her watch. I should circulate. But before I go, she lowered her voice slightly, I want you to know that not everyone accepted Maxwell's version of events after your divorce. Some of us have been watching your career with interest, waiting to see what you do once you were free of his influence. The validation from such a respected figure in their industry brought unexpected tears to Susan's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Thank you for telling me that. Victoria nodded once, decisively. My office will be in touch next week. And Susan, wear that emerald necklace to our meeting. It suits you perfectly. As Victoria moved away to join another conversation, Susan touched the emerald at her throat, the weight of it suddenly more meaningful. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Whenever you wear it, remember that you come from women who create beauty and survive hardship. Tag a sister who helped you through your darkest times. We all need that one person who believes in us when we forget how to believe in ourselves. The evening continued to unfold like a dream with occasional nightmarish elements. Moments of triumph and validation interspersed with painful reminders of the past. Former friends approached cautiously, some offering genuine reconnection, others clearly calculating the shifting social equations as Susan's apparent success registered. Through it all, Josephine remained at her side, a fierce guardian against the worst of the social predators and a warm presence during the emotional highs and lows. Susan had never been more grateful for her sister's unwavering support. Victoria Chun, Josephine whispered after the CEO had moved on. That's a power move even Maxwell can't ignore. What did she want? Susan explained the potential project in hushed tones, still hardly believing the opportunity that had materialized. Lead designer on a Meridian project? Josephine's eyes widened. Sue, that's major. Like, career-defining major. If it happens, Susan cautioned, not wanting to get ahead of herself. We're just going to talk next week. Oh, it'll happen, Josephine said confidently. I saw the way she looked at you, like she'd found exactly what she was searching for. And the way she looked at Maxwell afterward? Pure, I win energy. Susan laughed despite herself. Not everything is a competition, Joe. In this crowd, everything is absolutely a competition. Josephine sipped her champagne. Speaking of which, your ex-husband has been watching you like a hawk all evening. I think he's trying to decide whether to ignore you for the rest of the night or make another attempt at reasserting dominance. Susan followed her sister's gaze to where Maxwell stood with a small group of business associates, his attention ostensibly on their conversation but his awareness clearly fixed on her. The look in his eyes was one she recognized from their marriage, calculation mixed with a proprietary interest that had once seemed protective but she now recognized as controlling. Let him watch, Susan said, surprising herself with the lack of anxiety she felt. I'm not here for him. That's my girl, Josephine grinned. Now I'm going to get us fresh drinks. Try not to start any revolutions while I'm gone. As Josephine made her way to the bar, Susan found herself momentarily alone, a rare state in the crowded ballroom. She took the opportunity to simply breathe, to feel the weight of the evening's emotions without having to manage them for an audience. 6 years ago, standing in this same ballroom as Maxwell's wife, she had been a different person. Carefully curated, constantly vigilant, her authentic self buried beneath layers of accommodation and compromise. She had believed, as Maxwell had taught her to believe, that her value derived from her association with him, that her talents were merely complementary to his vision, that her purpose was to enhance his life rather than create her own. The journey from that woman to the one who stood here tonight had been brutal, marked by public humiliation, financial hardship, and moments of despair so profound she'd questioned whether she could survive them. There had been nights when Eliza was finally asleep and Susan had sat alone in her small kitchen, bills spread before her, wondering if Maxwell had been right, if she truly couldn't function without him. The Chicago project had been her lifeline during those darkest times. A small boutique hotel on the verge of bankruptcy had taken a chance on her fledgling design firm, unable to afford the established names but willing to gamble on a talented designer with something to prove. Susan had poured everything into that project. Her creativity, her determination, her desperate need to prove Maxwell wrong. When the hotel had reopened to rave reviews and rapidly increasing bookings, the owner had credited Susan's design as the key factor in its success. That testimonial had led to another project, then another. Each success had rebuilt a piece of her confidence. Each client who valued her vision had helped restore her belief in her own worth. And through it all, Eliza had watched and learned. Despite Maxwell's attempts to turn their daughter against her, Eliza had witnessed her mother's struggle and resilience firsthand. She had seen Susan work late into the night after tucking her in, had accompanied her to client meetings when childcare fell through, had celebrated each small victory and comforted her through each setback. Your father believes that value comes from power and wealth, Susan had told Eliza during a particularly difficult period when Maxwell's child support payments were mysteriously delayed for the 3rd month in a row. But there are many kinds of wealth and many kinds of power. The ability to create something beautiful from nothing, that's a kind of wealth. The strength to start over when everything is taken from you, that's a kind of power. Eliza, 13 at the time, had considered this with the seriousness that characterized her approach to life. Is that why you don't hate him? Because you know you have your own power? The question had startled Susan with its insight. I suppose that's part of it, she'd answered honestly. But mostly, I don't hate him because hate takes too much energy. Energy I'd rather put into loving you and building our new life. Now, watching Maxwell across the crowded ballroom, Susan realized that was still true. She didn't hate him. What she felt was something more complex. A mixture of gratitude for Eliza, sadness for the genuine love that had existed in their early years, and a clear-eyed recognition of the fundamental incompatibility that had doomed their marriage from the start. Maxwell needed to dominate. Susan needed to create. In the end, those needs had proven mutually exclusive. "Penny for your thoughts." A voice interrupted her reflection. She turned to find Lawrence Harrington had rejoined her, 2 champagne flutes in hand. "Your sister asked me to deliver this. She got waylaid by an old friend at the bar." "Thank you." Susan accepted the glass with a smile. "I was just processing." "A lot to process tonight, I imagine," Lawrence observed, his gaze sympathetic. "Returning to the scene of so many memories, facing down the past, and discovering unexpected futures," Susan added, thinking of Victoria Chen's offer. "Ah yes, I saw you speaking with Victoria. Formidable woman. Very. She's proposing a fascinating project. A hotel concept designed specifically for women business travelers." Lawrence nodded appreciatively. "That sounds exactly like something Victoria would champion, and exactly the kind of project where your particular talents would shine." "You seem to have a high opinion of my work," Susan observed, curious about his apparent familiarity with her portfolio. "I make it my business to know who's doing interesting things in the industry," Lawrence replied easily. "And to be perfectly honest, I've kept an eye on your career since the divorce. I always thought Maxwell made a catastrophic error in how he handled things, both personally and professionally." "Professionally?" Susan questioned, surprised by this assessment. Absolutely. You were one of his greatest assets, both as a designer and as a partner who balanced his sharper tendencies. The Westbrook brand has suffered without your influence. The newer properties lack the warmth and innovation that characterized the hotels you worked on. It was a perspective Susan hadn't considered, that Maxwell might have damaged his own business in his eagerness to excise her from his life. The thought was oddly comforting, a reminder that their relationship had been one of mutual contribution rather than the one-sided dependency he had tried to establish in its aftermath. "That's kind of you to say," she said, not wanting to appear to take pleasure in any setbacks Maxwell might have experienced, despite the temptation. "Not kind. Accurate." Lawrence's gaze drifted to where Maxwell now stood alone at the edge of the dance floor, watching them with undisguised intensity. "And I believe he knows it, though he'd never admit it. Maxwell has always been his own worst enemy when it comes to pride." Before Susan could respond, the orchestra began playing a familiar waltz, the same one that had played during her first dance with Maxwell at their wedding. The coincidence seemed too pointed to be accidental, and when she glanced at Maxwell, the challenging look in his eyes confirmed her suspicion. He had requested the song deliberately, a power move designed to evoke memories and perhaps vulnerability. Lawrence followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his expression. "Ah, your wedding waltz." "Yes," Susan admitted, feeling a complex surge of emotions. Nostalgia, pain, and a touch of anger at the manipulation. "Well then," Lawrence set down his champagne glass and extended his hand with a slight bow. "May I have this dance? It seems a shame to let a perfectly good waltz go to waste." The invitation was offered with such gentle understanding that Susan found herself accepting before she had fully processed the implications. As Lawrence led her onto the dance floor, she was acutely aware of Maxwell watching, his expression darkening as he realized his attempt to unsettle her had backfired. Lawrence proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the waltz with confident ease. "I hope you don't mind my presumption," he said as they moved across the floor. "It seemed the most elegant way to counter whatever game Maxwell is playing." "Not at all," Susan assured him, relaxing into the familiar rhythm. "Though I'm surprised you recognized what was happening." "I've known Maxwell for 30 years, Lawrence reminded her. "I'm well acquainted with his tactics. Music has always been one of his more subtle weapons. He remembers every significant song from every relationship and deploys them strategically." The insight was so accurate that Susan missed a step, quickly recovering as Lawrence adjusted seamlessly. "You really do understand him." "Understanding Maxwell was once essential to my survival, both in business and socially," Lawrence admitted. "We were partners for nearly a decade before circumstances revealed incompatibilities in our approaches." There was a story there, Susan sensed, but before she could inquire further, she became aware of a shift in the atmosphere around them. Other dancers were glancing their way, then toward the edge of the floor where Maxwell stood watching. The waltz was drawing to a close, and as the final notes sounded, Lawrence executed a perfect turn that positioned them directly in Maxwell's line of sight. "Thank you for the dance," Susan said as they separated, genuinely grateful for his understanding and support. "The pleasure was mine," Lawrence replied with a warm smile. "And if I'm not mistaken, you're about to have an opportunity to demonstrate just how completely you've moved beyond the past." Before Susan could ask what he meant, she sensed a presence behind her and turned to find Maxwell standing there, his expression a careful mask of social politeness that didn't quite conceal the tension beneath. "Susan," he said, his voice carrying that note of authority she had once found so compelling. "I wonder if I might have a word, in private." The request, or rather, the command thinly disguised as a request, hung between them. 6 years ago, she would have acquiesced automatically, conditioned to respond to that tone with immediate compliance. Even a year ago, she might have agreed out of lingering habit or a desire to avoid conflict. But tonight, standing in the emerald necklace her grandmother had given her, fresh from a conversation with Victoria Chan about a potentially career-defining opportunity, Susan felt no compulsion to accommodate Maxwell's desires. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," she replied, her voice calm but firm. I'm enjoying the evening as it is. If you have something to discuss, we can speak right here. Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation at being denied. He glanced at Lawrence, who had remained nearby, then back to Susan. Very well. I wanted to discuss Eliza's winter break plans. I was thinking of taking her to the chalet in Aspen for Christmas. The request was reasonable on its surface. They had joint custody during school holidays, but Susan recognized the underlying strategy. By raising a co-parenting issue in this public setting, Maxwell was attempting to reestablish their connection on his terms, to remind everyone watching that they remained linked through their daughter, regardless of Susan's apparent independence. Eliza and I have already discussed her winter break, Susan replied evenly. She's expressed a strong preference for our usual arrangement. Christmas Eve and morning with me, the remainder of the break with you. She's particularly looking forward to the college tour you promised. Maxwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Clearly, he hadn't expected Susan to be so well informed about his plans with their daughter. I see. Well, plans can always be adjusted. The chalet would be available for both of you, of course, if you'd like to join us for part of the holiday. The invitation, delivered with calculated casualness, was another maneuver, an attempt to position himself as the magnanimous ex-husband extending an olive branch. Susan recognized it for what it was. Not a genuine desire for her company, but a public demonstration of his continued influence over her life. That's very generous, she said, matching his tone of casual politeness. But I've already committed to a project in Chicago that will keep me busy through the holidays. Eliza understands. In fact, she's quite proud of the opportunity. Chicago. Maxwell's interest sharpened visibly. What project? Susan smiled, allowing herself a small moment of satisfaction. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details yet, but I'm sure you'll hear about it once it's announced. The deliberate echo of the corporate discretion Maxwell had always insisted upon, the countless times he had used, "I'm not at liberty to discuss" to shut down her questions about his business dealings, was not lost on him. His expression tightened further, the mask of polite interest slipping to reveal a flash of genuine annoyance. I see, he said again, though clearly he didn't, not fully. Well, I wouldn't want to keep you from your networking. He glanced meaningfully toward Lawrence, the implication clear in his tone. Maxwell, Lawrence interjected smoothly, always a pleasure to observe your unique approach to co-parenting. If you'll excuse us, I believe Victoria Chun was hoping to continue her conversation with Susan before the evening ends. Maxwell's expression hardened at the mention of Victoria Chun, his longtime business rival. Of course, he said, his tone clipped. Don't let me keep you from opportunities. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at Susan with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Something between frustration and a reluctant reassessment. You look well, Susan, he said finally. The emerald, it suits you. It always did. The unexpected acknowledgement of the necklace he had so despised during their marriage left Susan momentarily speechless. By the time she recovered, Maxwell had already walked away, his tall figure cutting through the crowd with the same commanding presence that had once seemed so attractive to her. Well, Lawrence said quietly beside her. That was interesting. Yes, Susan agreed, touching the emerald at her throat. It was. Subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories of women who refused to be written off or diminished. As the evening drew to a close, Susan found herself in a quiet corner of the ballroom with Josephine, both sisters observing the gradually thinning crowd with the satisfied exhaustion of warriors after a successful battle. Mission accomplished? Josephine asked, nodding toward where Maxwell now stood with a group of business associates, his manner outwardly composed but his attention still occasionally drifting toward Susan. I think so, Susan replied, though I'm not entirely sure what the mission was anymore. Showing up as yourself, Josephine reminded her. Proving that his narrative about you was false. Reclaiming your place in a world he tried to exclude you from. When you put it that way, yes. Mission definitely accomplished. Susan smiled, feeling a deep contentment that went beyond the satisfaction of proving Maxwell wrong. But something unexpected happened too. Victoria Chan and her project? Josephine guessed. That, yes. But also... Susan paused, trying to articulate the subtle but profound shift she'd experienced throughout the evening. I realized I don't need this world anymore. I don't need their validation or acceptance. I came tonight thinking I had something to prove, but the truth is, I've already proven it, to myself, to Eliza, to the people who truly matter. Josephine studied her sister's face, her expression softening. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just surviving what he did to you, but discovering you're happier with the life you built than the one he took away. Exactly. Susan's gaze drifted around the opulent ballroom, seeing it now with different eyes. The crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the carefully curated luxury that had once seemed the pinnacle of success now felt somehow hollow compared to the authentic life she created. Her small but growing business, her cozy townhouse filled with objects chosen for love rather than status, her genuine relationships uncomplicated by wealth and power dynamics. Ready to go home? Josephine asked, sensing her sister's shift in mood. More than ready, Susan confirmed. As they collected their wraps from the coat check, Susan became aware of Diane hovering nearby, clearly wanting to speak but hesitant to approach directly. When their eyes met, the housekeeper moved closer, her voice low. Ms. Monroe, I just wanted to say, it was wonderful to see you tonight. Truly wonderful. Thank you, Diane, Susan replied warmly. It was good to see you too. Diane glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one was within earshot, then continued in a rush. He's not the same since you left, you know. The house is like a museum now. Perfect but empty. He works all the time, barely sleeps. Miss Eliza says he's different when she visits, tries to be present, but as soon as she leaves, she shook her head slightly. I shouldn't be telling you this. It's all right, Susan assured her, touched by the woman's concern despite the complicated emotions it stirred. I hope he finds happiness, I really do. Just not at my expense anymore. Diane nodded, understanding in her eyes. You look happy, Ms. Monroe. It suits you even better than that beautiful necklace. With those words, she slipped away, returning to her duties before her absence could be noticed. Susan watched her go, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Compassion for the emptiness Diane described, gratitude for her own hard-won contentment, and a final release of the lingering guilt she'd carried about the failure of her marriage. Outside, the autumn night had grown colder, the city lights glittering against the dark sky. As they waited for their car, Josephine looped her arm through Susan's. So, Chicago for Christmas? She asked, referencing the project Susan had mentioned to Maxwell. Is that really happening? It might be, Susan admitted. Victoria seems serious about moving quickly if our meeting goes well. The flagship hotel would be in Chicago, and the initial design phase would need to happen over the winter. Eliza will understand, Josephine assured her. That girl is your biggest fan, you know. She tells everyone about her mom, the badass designer who rebuilt her life from scratch. Susan laughed, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of her daughter's fierce pride. She's exaggerating a bit. I had help. I had you. Damn right you did, Josephine agreed with a grin. Someone had to remind you how amazing you were when you forgot. Their car arrived, and as they settled into the back seat, Susan took one last look at the gleaming facade of the Westbrook Hotel. 6 years ago, she had left this building in tears, her belongings hastily packed, her future terrifyingly uncertain. Tonight, she was leaving on her own terms, head high, heart full, with new possibilities unfolding before her. Take us home, please, she told the driver, and meant it in every sense of the word. The townhouse was quiet when Susan returned, the babysitter having fallen asleep on the couch despite her best efforts to wait up for the full report. Susan gently woke the college student, paid her generously for the late night, and saw her safely into a rideshare before checking on Eliza. Her daughter was sound asleep, dark hair spread across her pillow, looking younger in sleep than her 16 years. Susan stood in the doorway for a moment, overwhelmed with love and gratitude for this remarkable young woman who had weathered the storm of her parents' divorce with such resilience and wisdom. In the kitchen, Susan found a note propped against the fruit bowl in Eliza's neat handwriting. Hope you showed them all who's boss. Can't wait to hear everything. Love you, Mom. P.S. Made brownies. They're under the cake dome. You're welcome. Susan smiled, lifting the dome to find a plate of slightly lopsided but undoubtedly delicious brownies. She took one and sat at the small kitchen table, finally allowing the events of the evening to settle fully in her mind. The confrontation with Maxwell, the unexpected support from Lawrence, Victoria Chen's exciting proposal, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how she was perceived by the social world she had once been exiled from. All of it felt significant, yet somehow less important than she had anticipated. What mattered most was not the external validation but the internal certainty she now possessed, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth that no one, not even Maxwell Westbrook with all his wealth and influence, could ever again diminish. Her phone buzzed with a text from Josephine. Home safe. You were magnificent tonight. Sleep well, warrior queen. Susan smiled, typing back, you too. Love you. Breakfast tomorrow? The reply came immediately. Absolutely. Your place. I'll bring bagels, you provide details. Setting her phone aside, Susan finished her brownie and made her way to her bedroom. As she carefully removed the emerald necklace, placing it in its velvet box, she thought of her grandmother's words again. Whenever you wear it, remember that you come from women who create beauty and survive hardship. She had done both. Created beauty in her designs, in her home, in the relationship she'd rebuilt with her daughter. Survived the hardship of having her life dismantled, her worth questioned, her abilities dismissed. Not just survived, but thrived. 1 year later, Susan stood in the soaring lobby of the Athena, Meridian Properties flagship, women-focused luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. Snow fell gently outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the white flakes creating a magical backdrop for the hotel's grand opening celebration. The space around her was her most ambitious design yet, a perfect balance of strength and warmth, with innovative features specifically created for women travelers without a single patronizing pink accent or diminutive feminine touch. Instead, the design spoke of confidence, sophistication, and thoughtful attention to both security and comfort. It's magnificent, Susan, Victoria Chen said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. Everything I hoped for and more. The advance bookings have exceeded our projections by 30%. I'm so glad. Susan accepted the champagne with a smile. This project has been the most fulfilling of my career. And it's just the beginning, Victoria reminded her. The board approved the expansion to 3 additional cities yesterday. We'd like you to oversee the design for all of them, with your team handling the implementation. The news, while welcome, wasn't entirely unexpected. The Athena concept had generated buzz in the industry for months, with advance reviews praising its innovative approach to luxury hospitality for women. Susan's firm had grown to accommodate the increased workload, now employing 15 designers and support staff, including 2 promising young women Susan had mentored personally. I'd be honored, she told Victoria sincerely. As they clinked glasses to seal the agreement, Susan caught sight of a familiar figure across the lobby. Eliza, now 17 and even more poised, deep in conversation with one of the hotel's investors. Her daughter had flown in yesterday for the opening, insisting she wouldn't miss her mother's triumph for anything, not even the college preparation exam scheduled for the following week. Your daughter is remarkable, Victoria observed, following Susan's gaze. She was explaining the concept of spatial empowerment to Senator Williams earlier. The woman was so impressed she asked if Eliza was considering a future in politics. Susan laughed. Don't give her ideas. She's already planning to revolutionize family law after she finishes her education. A worthy goal, Victoria nodded approvingly. The system could use some revolution. Susan couldn't disagree. Despite the improvements in her co-parenting relationship with Maxwell over the past year, a gradual thawing that had begun, surprisingly, after the night of the gala, She remained acutely aware of how differently her divorce and custody battle might have unfolded without his wealth and influence tipping the scales. Maxwell himself had changed in subtle but significant ways since that night. The scorched earth campaign against her had ceased entirely. Child support payments arrived on time, without the previous administrative delays. He had even, in a moment that still occasionally stunned Susan when she recalled it, apologized for certain aspects of his behavior during and after their divorce. The apology, delivered during a parent-teacher conference they'd both attended for Eliza, had been characteristically Maxwell, limited in scope, careful in phrasing, more acknowledgement than true contrition. But it had been genuine, and Susan had accepted it as such. "Mom!" Eliza was making her way through the crowd now, her expression bright with excitement. "The mayor just arrived, and she's asking to meet the designer. Victoria, is it okay if I steal my mother for a few minutes?" "Of course," Victoria agreed with a smile. "I need to speak with the investors anyway. Susan, we'll continue our conversation about the expansion tomorrow." As Eliza led her toward the hotel entrance where the mayor waited, Susan felt a surge of pride, not just in the successful project or her growing business, but in the journey that had brought her here. From the devastated woman who had left the Westbrook Hotel in tears 6 years ago to the confident designer now being sought out by the mayor of Chicago, the transformation was profound. "You're glowing, Mom," Eliza observed as they navigated through the crowded lobby. "I don't think I've ever seen you look so fulfilled." "I am," Susan confirmed, squeezing her daughter's hand. "This project, this moment, it feels like everything I've worked for coming together perfectly." "Not just the project," Eliza said perceptively. You've come together perfectly." The insight, so typical of her daughter's emotional intelligence, brought unexpected tears to Susan's eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Eliza replied simply. "A mother who showed me that true strength isn't about power or money or control. It's about rebuilding yourself when someone tries to break you. It's about creating beauty from whatever materials life leaves you with." Susan blinked back tears, recognizing her grandmother's philosophy echoed in her daughter's words. The legacy of resilient, creative women continued, passing from generation to generation like the emerald necklace now safely stored in Susan's hotel suite upstairs. "I love you, Eliza," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than anything in this world." "I know, Mom," Eliza smiled, confident in that love. "Now come meet the mayor. She's going to love you almost as much as I do." As they approached the distinguished woman waiting near the entrance, Susan straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her journey. The pain and the triumph, the loss and the rebuilding, settle into a perfect balance within her. Maxwell had once believed he could diminish her, render her insignificant without his support and validation. Instead, freed from the constraints of his expectations and control, she had blossomed into her fullest self. The emerald necklace might be upstairs in its velvet box, but its meaning remained with her always. She came from women who created beauty and survived hardship. Now she had become one of those women herself, and in doing so had shown her daughter how to become one too. That, Susan reflected as she extended her hand to greet the mayor, was the most meaningful success of all. If the story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone tried to tear it down? Have you discovered that your greatest strength emerged from your deepest struggle? Remember, Queens, no one, not a partner, not a critic, not anyone with wealth or power, gets to write the final chapter of your story. Only you hold that pen. And sometimes, the most beautiful story begins exactly when someone else thinks it's over.